would like to welcome you to the Middle East, to the International Peace Institute for the Middle East and North Africa on this particular webinar on countering violent extremism during times of crisis. And God knows how many crises we are facing and we are challenging. But we, of course, all of us agree that in crises, wise people like you would see always opportunities. Of course, against the backdrop of increasing tides of national populism, racism, xenophobia, gender inequality and discrimination, the coronavirus pandemic is exposing the cracks across societies, and we are seeing increasing cases of violent extremism. Within the International Peace Institute's key report made public in the famous Independent Commission on Multilateralism, ICM, we emphasized, that was a few years ago, that's a report that was requested by outgoing Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and delivered during the Passover to his successor, Antonio Guterres. The IPI emphasized the importance of centralizing leadership on counterterrorism and the prevention of violent extremism. This would bring greater consistency on and coherence, of course, on and to programming the multilateral and other forms of combating this plague. The idea that terrorism and violent extremism can be defeated primarily by military force, law enforcement measures, and intelligence operations is losing currency. A paradigm shift is taking place from counterterrorism to countering violent extremism towards preventing violent extremism. Within our report, we stressed that as a part of concerted multilateral approach to countering and preventing violent extremism, a new narrative needs to be produced to neutralize and dilute extremist ideologies. Such messages can be developed by a new task force or ad hoc committee comprising religious leaders, individuals from civil society and the private sector, and above all, youth actors from around the globe. It should be held up to our hearts that all these schemes should be led by an organization or institution that can provide adequate political space for such discussion. In line with this, we look forward to hearing our panelists today to share their expertise and thoughts on this important and timely issue. Let me start by giving the floor to my dear colleague, a young lady who's leading us today, Eliza Shea. Eliza, you have the floor, my friend.
Thank you, and I'm happy that you all could join us virtually today to discuss one of the most important issues we're facing as a global community. The global community has experienced increasing levels of insecurity over the last several decades, and with this, sentiments of hatred have espoused exponentially, characterized by the frequency of radical, populist, xenophobic, and discriminatory acts that we've seen recently. As these insecurities and sentiments continue to compound and manifest in the context of the global public health emergency, with it, so have the threat of extremism, conflict, and violence. Extremist entities seek to exploit and penetrate social fray with unrelenting potency from the fringes of society. They prey on despair when community resilience and cohesion is at its weakest, most prevalent during times of crises. To counter extremism, our strategies must expose the flaws and hatred contained in terrorist appeals, whether it be about grievances, actual or perceived inequalities and injustice, and such problems that societies face. using compelling arguments that are founded on reason and analysis. But nor is it enough to simply rebut extremist narratives with facts. We must actively find source of these societal ruptures and vulnerabilities and address its causes, in order to build long-term resilience in its place and prevent future upheavals from occurring. We as a global community must take a dynamic and multilateral approach that matches the fluidity of extremism, an approach that involves the whole of societies in order to counter and ultimately prevent violent extremism. In this regard, I would like to highlight a few of the key areas of focus that support such an approach. I'll be brief, as all of you today are experts in this field. Firstly, education. The importance of quality education and the role of educational institutions cannot be emphasized enough. It's the foundation for equipping and developing the skills that integrate the universal values that comprise a culture of peace that's championed by the UN and UNESCO. So education is essentially the gateway to peace. Supporting and empowering gatekeepers of peace inside and outside of the classroom, which includes parents, teachers, peers, as well as religious and community leaders who have deep understanding of and access to their communities, should be leveraged in order to achieve an environment of support, tolerance, and peace, especially amid times of great uncertainty that can resist the appeal of extremism. Educational strategies such as the curriculum itself should aim to address the push and pull factors of violent extremism in order to combat it. Moreover, curricula must also be progressive and include necessary lessons of the digital era, such as internet safety, education, and media literacy programs. This need is more apparent now than ever, whereby COVID has disrupted the full-time education for 1.6 billion students and have moved to online education where possible. Both of these outcomes leads to the increase of internet usage and inevitable increases in the exposure to extremist materials. It is by reflecting best practices through building learners' resilience, which will enable individuals to craft the mentalities that can deflect, discredit, and dismiss any ideas about or promoting violent extremism, and will lead to its eventual negation. Secondly, traditional and new media together connects our world, carrying great influence in their messaging and reach. It offers largely untapped opportunities to shape attitudes from an early age, which make it both a boon and a bane in trying to counter extremism. Social media, entertainment programs, and news media oftentimes reinforce extremely harmful narratives and are fueled by political motivations. They can become arenas of disinformation, hate speech, and outright platforms for extremist propaganda to proliferate and spread. This results in the very hostility and the harmful narratives that media can and should combat. As such, we must stop this cycle by repurposing media outlets for good through practicing objective reporting and coverage of events, employing a language of peace, and raising awareness through amplifying the correct community voices, which in all fairness should include rehabilitated terrorists as the most credible messengers to the harms of terrorism. Moreover, the private sector should work closely with governments in order to implement legislation and guidelines to curb the dissemination of extremist narratives and materials, and subsequently enforce the appropriate consequences for those who violate it. Last and certainly not least, speaking as a young woman, I can proudly and firmly say that youth and women are agents of peace. I do not need to remind you how our engagement at the discussion table at the local, regional, and multilateral levels is non-negotiable, especially when seeking to bridge short-term concerns and long-term objectives with regard to preventing extremism and beyond. As the leaders of our collective futures, increasing investment in young men and women is a strategy that will reap unparalleled dividends. Their empowerment and resilience influences and underlines entire communities and results in more holistic societal resilience from fallen victim to extremism. We already know the efficacy of so many grassroots initiatives that have been led by youth and women in this sector. I will conclude by reiterating how our world has become a small village. These threats of extremism that occur at one end of the globe has an impact and can destabilize entire regions on the other end. However, the same principle should ring true with the impact of peace. We can counter and prevent extremism through sustained global action, keeping open channels of dialogue, collaboration, and cooperation between and within states, and embrace the responsibility of our own actions. holding accountability to others as we are all members of the global community in order to achieve a future that is free of violence, that knows durable peace and sustainable development. I look forward to hearing the unique and insight and knowledge that each of you have to share with us today on the issue. Thank you.
You're muted, Nejib.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Eliza. I'll join my voice and that of Dalia and all my colleagues, IPI in New York and Vienna, to the appeals that you have launched. And as before giving the floor to my colleagues here, I will put one request. I hope that after this webinar, we come up with some practical steps to turn within our motto as a think tank. We are not only a think tank, we are a do tank. So let's see where each and every one of us would suggest ideas to implement or to contribute to the regional global efforts to improve the combat of extremism, to reduce it within a strategy to eradicate it, which is ambitious, but it is doable. Without further ado, I will ask my friend, Professor Fadi Daw, first to, I think, recognize that both of us are proud to be a minority in this webinar. I see women are outnumbering us, and I'm so proud of that. Aren't we, Fadi?
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Is Fadi muted?
I'm fine.
So
yeah. Okay.
let me say a few things about Fadi. In addition to him being my friend, Fadi is the chairperson of the famous and CEO of Adyan Religions, Adyan Foundation, where he contributes in Lebanon and internationally to the promotion of the coexistence, interfaith relations, and inclusive citizenship. Most recently, he is one of the 10 global heroes who won the 2020 Elevate Prize, which recognized the foundation's outstanding work in empowering individuals across the MENA region and beyond to lead the change and contribute to more just and inclusive societies for all. His mission is rooted in and reflects the integration of three distinct dimensions: on the academic level, policy-making level, and the spiritual level. This is just a drop of the ocean that could be navigated, I would say, through on.
Thank you, Nejib.
And thank you again, my friend, for your relentless efforts to reach our objectives, all peace and sustainable development. The floor of yours, Fadi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be again together and within this, the framework of this panel. And I'm glad to contribute to this reflection with the International Peace Institute. And I would like to thank Eliza also for the communication and the preparation of this panel. Of course, it's, in 10 minutes, we just can share some insights, some ideas about such a very wide topic. And I will do it based on our experience during the last 10 years in our foundation, with some maybe practical suggestions, as you mentioned, Nejib, where we can maybe continue working on them and thinking together on some important points today. Let me start by saying that, countering violent extremism, so it's not a new topic, and even it's becoming a kind of outpast topic by new ones on the table, which are very much related. And the challenge, I think, is to create the correlation between the PVE or CVE and, for example, hate speech, and 4, freedom of religion and belief, which are becoming, I think, more sexy topics on the international agenda nowadays. So I will try to say why it's very important to keep the connection between, and to have a comprehensive approach where we can see the correlation between these different topics. Yet, let me first start telling you a little bit about our theory of change in preventing violent extremism, our work in the foundation. And here, if we can share one slide that can briefly summarize this, because this may help in in understanding the approach that I would be presenting. In fact, based on our experience of something like 10 years of experience working in this field, we came out with this theory of change that is based on identifying 4 distinct spheres in the society related to violent extremism or preventing and countering violent extremism. So those 4 spheres are, if I start by the end, the number 4, which is the black one at the center, it's the active violent extremists, which means the terrorists themselves who are actively, using violence against civilians. So either individuals or group or networks. And I go to the other extreme, which is the number 1 in blue, the sphere in blue, which is, I would call it the peace builders community. The civil societies, international organizations, governments who are, and individuals who are striving to, prevent violent extremism and to build peace in societies. I think the most important 2 spheres are the most invisible one and sometimes marginalized one, or not enough taken into consideration in our strategies in PVE, which are the number 2 and 3. Number 3 is it's the sphere of the individuals who are vulnerable to extremism, which means that those individuals who are ready to do the step needed to pass to to join the violent networks and to become practically, I would say, extremists. And the number 2 is the community-based influencers who are in contact with those individuals in number 3 and in contact with number 1 also, with the peace builder community. So what is the difference between these 4 spheres? Between the first and the fourth one, the difference is based on values. The first sphere, the main values of the first sphere are human rights, peace, rule of law, and justice. I think all of us work for this and strive to advance these values. While the number 4 sphere, which means the terrorist spheres, their values are community rights, depending on how they define their communities, violence, rule of force, or sometimes of divine force or ideological force, but against rule of law. Here we have the rule of force, and then revenge rather than justice. So what is very important, in fact, and where we try to work as foundation is in sphere 2 and 3, because it's useless, and sometimes, unfortunately, lots of efforts, lots of funds, lots of strategies are done working within the sphere 1, and we stay, speaking to converted people and working with the converted people without any influence on sphere 3. If we really want to prevent extremism, it is about limiting the number of individuals who pass from 3 to 4. And so to reach number 3, we should also acknowledge that number 1 cannot reach number 3. And why? Because we don't have the same narrative. And number 3, there are people who are attracted by the values of number 4, but have the same narrative of number 2. And what is the narrative of number 2? It's a community-based narrative, usually in tension with citizenship, and sometimes in clash with secular or nationalistic narratives in countries. Secondly, the narrative is also a grievance narrative, either for social, economic, political, or security reasons. Most of the time, I think, and I think the most important point is that ensure the success of a CVE or PVE strategy is by starting to identify and recognize what is fair and true in the narrative of the spheres 2 and 3. Because without starting from there, I think any action would always be faced by those who are in sphere 3 by rejection, and those who are in sphere 2 by doubt you know, and some kind of conspiracy theories. So to make a long story short, the theory behind all this is in fact to invite those who are in number one, like us, to identify the right people in sphere two, which means community-based influencers. They can be religious leaders, they can be civil society, faith-based organizations, traditional networks, but those who can reach, in fact, especially the young in sphere three. So identify them, be able to understand and recognize their narrative, because they don't speak the same language, even though if they speak English like us or Arabic like us, but they have a specific language, which means a specific narrative, I mean, here. So be able to understand, to take their narrative to the right place where it can be discussed in a public sphere based on the values of the group one, and so to use them, to make from them, or to empower them, to build their capacities, to provide them with resources to reach number three, to reach the sphere, the third sphere. So the second sphere reaching the third sphere, since by resources, by empowerment, by capacity building, and so to provide to those who are isolated in sphere three, because the main problem, in fact, is the isolation factor, and I will go back to this point within the sphere three. So to reach the isolated young people in sphere three, and to provide them with skills, with tools, with spaces for dialogue and for engagement to change their situation and their society. So, because I think to finish this first part in my presentation, the best result in PVE was all the time, in fact, shown in our practice, is when you provide isolated individuals in sphere three the capacity to influence their societies, to become change makers, to become those who are able to change their situations and their society. So how it can be done? Practically, in my organization, we work on this on different levels, all these levels trying to reach the sphere two, as I mentioned, empowering sphere two to reach sphere three. So on policy level, of course, it's to open a dialogue, a sincere dialogue based on trust with those people, in fact. And one of the results of this dialogue, for example, we published a white paper. It's available online. I will share it with you now. It is about it's white paper for interreligious collaboration and collaboration with religious leaders and policy making in addressing radicalization and violent extremism. So it's a white paper with recommendation, but based on a sincere dialogue with those actors, let's say. Second level is perceptions, media. This is why we created for the Arab region a platform called Ta'adudiya, which is among the most reaching platform in the Arab region. In the last 2-3 years, we reached 86 million persons in the Arab context. And it was identified, I mean, its content is being used now by Facebook company to generate content for PVE, in fact, for the Facebook strategy in PVE and CVE. Third level is to engage directly with people. So we created a forum. It's called the Forum for Religious Social Responsibility, where we engage religious actors, faith-based actors, who we build their capacities. We provide them with resources, finance, I mean funds, but also resources, different type of resources, educational and others, to engage with their young people on this level. And finally, a new project that we started now, it's a media literacy for schools on countering hate speech. To finish in 2 minutes, I still have 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, so to finish on this, I would like to link with the title, who is asking us, in fact, how we can counter extremists, violent extremism in times of crisis. This is, I think, now we are facing a new type of challenges with because we have so many crises, I would just focus on the pandemic as a major crisis that we are living today, and to say how this pandemic is affecting, in fact, our reality and our theory of change here. The challenge is, during this pandemic phase, I think the governments in the first sphere are challenged, because we are witnessing more and more state of emergencies in countries. you know, and this is a challenge for the rule of law in different countries, and this definitely is an additional reason for those who are in sphere 4, the extremists, you know, to push or to pull individuals vulnerable to extremists to themselves, because they can use this narrative against the governments and their state of emergencies and restrictions on security and social life. So this is one of the new challenges, I think, that has to be taken into consideration. The second challenge is, I wrote recently an article on Ta'adudiyya called The Invisible Diversity. All the data is showing now. I took the example of Sweden, United States, and some other countries, where, in fact, when you look at the population affected by COVID-19, the data related to them, you see that within the minorities, the number of victims are much more higher than the predominant majority, cultural or religious or ethnic majorities in countries. There are reasons for this, of course, but this is already a fact that will increase the grievances among those minorities also and those population. And we know how much grievances not really addressed or well addressed are also one of the major roots of the spread of extremism in societies. So this is another, I think, challenge and concern. And the last one during this pandemic is the increased isolation of individuals because of the current, you know, social distancing on the practical level, so more and more individuals who are already vulnerable to extremism are being more and more isolated behind, you know, their screens, and so more exposed also to violent narrative. And this is a third challenge during this pandemic. How we cope with all the things, and I'm finishing on this. I think we need today to rethink, you know, if we look at the UN narrative during the last decade, we see this evolution from CT, counterterrorism, to CVE, countering violent extremism, to PVE, preventing violent extremism. I think we need to consider the three not as a paradigm shift, but as three different approaches to the same paradigm or the same concept. But we need to widen it today and to have a more comprehensive approach, including within it hate speech and freedom of religion and belief, because these are, and we have, you know, the 2012 plan of Rabat plan of action of the UN. We have the UN strategy 2019 on hate speech, countering hate speech. So we have now new narrative, important narrative. I think it has to be connected and not still, you know, fragmented as it is now, with a comprehensive approach that can be more helpful. And secondly, and finally, I think we need also to enhance the networking among the actors also, and to create more, I think, solid networks and efficient networks in collaboration in facing CVE, especially in this time of pandemic and what will come after it. And thank you so much.
Shukran, Dr. Fadi. I think you gave me hope as completely null in maths. You gave me now the idea that you should have been my math professor during my young age, where I was completely out of it now through your mathematically political presentation of the issue, with equations, with transition, with all the theorems. I got it. And it's such a very, very interesting approach that you have shared with us. And I'm sure we will first regret that we haven't started working with you earlier, but it's never too late. So thank you again. And I'm sure we'll get together in the near future to put into concrete and I would say more practical modalities what you have suggested now, pending, of course, what we will hear from Catherine and, of course, May. Now I will give Catherine the floor. تفضلي سيدتي الميكروفون معك.
Shukran jazilan, and thank you so much for having this opportunity to engage in knowledge exchange. And just a brief background on how I've been working on these issues. Almost 20 years now, I have been working with people whom Dr. Fadi might place in the category number 3, so people with grievances. Are you with me?
Mea culpa, because I forgot to, I have a few words to say about you, if you allow me. I'm so sorry for that. Okay. Catherine is a researcher at the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. Catherine holds a PhD in anthropology from London School of Economics and Political Science. Her chief theoretical interests lie in the anthropological approaches to the study of nationalism and the far populist, radical, and extreme right. Catherine speaks Hebrew and Arabic. Shalom, salam. In addition to academia, she has worked for the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, in Syria 2005. Maybe you have came across one another, because I was in that area from 98 to 2006. And she carried out consultancy work for the World Bank, Norway's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the European Commission. She also regularly provides expert analysis to policy communities, as well as print and broadcast media. Thank you, Catherine. I hope I'm doing just a little bit of justice to the long and rich career that you have despite your young age.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. So I have also, as you mentioned, lived for a long time in the Middle East, but the past 5 years, and since I came back to Norway, I've been focusing more on far-right extremism in Europe and beyond. But I think still the Middle East also very much plays a part in that, in informing the enemy images and the disinformation and the online hate campaigns that are being authored in Europe and elsewhere. So today I'm gonna have a few notes on how, as my colleague just mentioned, how what we're seeing today is not just one crisis, but the interaction of multiple crises coming together, of economy, of insecurity, of displacement, and of health emergencies. And all these crises of globalization have acted in a way to destabilize identities and livelihoods and insecurities for the future. Now, the past year and in 2019, I was examining and addressing a new trend we've seen in terrorism, and that is white supremacist terrorist attacks that has emerged as a new type of threat at a global level. So in the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand, inspired further mass atrocities in the US and also in Norway and in Germany. And although these young male perpetrators in the 20s acted alone, they were nevertheless interconnected in a transnational online digital subculture. So it makes sense in the digital area to talk about transnational connections between actors in the MENA region, in Europe, in New Zealand, and in North America. So in terms of methods, I'm an anthropologist, so normally I'm used to interviewing activists face to face, as I've done in Israel, in the UK and elsewhere. But now I've been observing and analyzing visual cultures on these online platforms. And I don't know if you heard about it, but 4chan it's one of these platforms I've been analyzing, and they have been at the forefront of this information campaign for almost a decade and a half now. And I've been analyzing real-life violent escalations of internet culture. And we've seen that COVID-19 has created this new source of anger and frustration for some individuals. and they target both symbolic goals for the personal grievance, be they racial or anti-government. Now, in 2019, we saw how enemy images of the Muslim others, so Islamophobic enemy images, were very much on the forefront of this digital environment. And it also was came together with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So essential conspiracy theories is that Jews are using Muslims as a biological weapon to systematically replace and destroy the white race. And as we know, activists, they always creatively reinvent grammars of exclusion when they face a new crisis. So in 2020, we saw a new layer emerging that followed this older anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that Bill Gates and George Soros, that liberals and globalists are using the virus as a bioweapon to achieve world dominance and control of the white race. And others mobilize anti-Chinese tropes, claiming that COVID-19 is a bioweapon developed by China to destroy the West. And it's quite evident that all these new enemy images follow all the both colonial lines and also racist lines. So the big question is like the huge amount of online hate campaigns or disinformation we're facing now, how much does it really impact violent action in real life? And as we've seen with 2019, which saw this unprecedented wave of terrorism, we've seen that several activists are motivated by such conspiratorial narratives and far-right beliefs, and they have crossed the Rubicon from thought to action. And now we've seen also in the US the past year several instances of violence and terror connected to the Boogaloo Boys, which is also emerging from this digital subculture. So you see that both symbols and terms that were co-authored in a transnational sphere are being now used in real life for mobilization and creating thick communities for belonging. And these activists, I have also interviewed some of them, they present themselves as heroic men willing to protect Western supremacy. In a way, there's so many similarities also with jihadi activists in a way, because their goal is obviously to obtain a pure society, and also to accelerate violent societal collapse in order to restore a race-pure society. And also the same sanctification of terrorists that are occurring. There's increasingly also being drawn on Christian iconography to portray the terrorists as heroic men willing to sacrifice their lives. We're also seeing amongst youngsters a quite worrying trend, which is the gamification of violence. So the terrorist event is to be executed and circulated and scored like a video game. And reducing victims to numbers and then rating terrorists and circulating memes of the atrocities become integral both to the act of dehumanization, but also to this emotional desensitization to violent acts. So the logic is that violence, emotions should be exploited in others and controlled in yourself. So if we're now looking at a new trend where we see the gamification of violence, we see real life escalations of internet culture into violent extremism. It's quite challenging to design effective CVE policies, particularly to an anonymous environment. Lots of these activists are actually propagating violent material, but they do it fast and anonymously. So I think some of these activists are not losers of globalization as elsewhere, not necessarily in a precarious situation, economically speaking, but they look at themselves as race warriors. So what can be done? I think to address these root causes, to have more knowledge on why some men violently reject the system. These are often very middle-class young men with existential insecurities, with an ideology with clear enemy images. And also limit exposure, because we know that the spread of propaganda matters in radicalization processes. And we know that big tech companies like Facebook, Twitter, they're all now trying to actively regulate and to hinder that their platforms are being exploited in propaganda circulation and also in the live streaming of atrocities. So I think in the next 10 years, we will see much more, not just by the companies themselves, but also by governments that will regulate internet spaces. So cyber governance and cooperation between states and tech companies. And as Eliza mentioned initially about the importance of education. So young people now born in the 90s are all addicted to the smartphones, as am I, a quite ambivalent relationship to my smartphone, but to really, when you grow up with conspiracy theories in your pockets, to really teach youngsters how to challenge these dehumanizing discourses and conspiratorial thinking about ethnic and religious minorities. And also we know that far-right digital subcultures, they derive strength and direction from critical events in real life. So national and supranational governments does play a critical role in safeguarding human dignity and democracy during crisis. And this entails obviously strategic communication to curb the spread of disinformation and scapegoating, and also enhance trust in science. So thank you for that. I look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. This is very, very interesting, very insightful. And I'm glad you referred to one of the key vectors for extremists, which are the social media platforms. And I hope your expectations within 10 years will be done with at least the major platforms to curb such narratives. And I think we have a lot of work to do because there are some platforms that are not digital at all. And I'm referring to what we are suffering from in this part of the world, people who meet 5 times a day in some, I would say, some mosques, and who have a convention on every Friday. I'm not saying that all of them have fallen into the I would say intolerable narratives, but there is a lot of work to do on that level, on the religious leaders to which both of you referred. And thank you again. Now I'd like to, last but not least, I'd like to hear the voice of this region from a woman. I will ask my dear speaker, May Salem. May is, in fact, the program manager for both the Preventing Radicalization and Extremism leading to Terrorism and Disarmament, Demobilization and Reintegration programs at the Cairo International Center for Conflict Resolution, Peacekeeping and Peace Building. It's a long title, my friend, but it's very, very interesting. May also was the lead expert on drafting the African Union Operational Guidance Note on DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. And of course, preventing, countering violent extremism. She also supported the development of the CCPA. It reminds me of the Soviet Union before, CCP. But training manuals, one of the PRELT, a unique preventive program that is founded on Islamic law. It's very interesting. And the other on combating human trafficking and smuggling of migrants in Africa. And before, I don't know what you're going to say, but there's one phenomenon that marked the few years after what we call the Arab Spring is the massive waves of women being forced, I would say, to join the extremist movements in Syria, Iraq, under the famous jihad and nikah, which is an aberration at both levels, or all levels, I would say. So the floor is yours, my friend, and we are all ears. Thank you, May.
Thank you very much, Nejib, for the introduction, and thank you and Eliza for the opening remarks and the communication until we reach this point. So I'll jump quickly to the presentation. I don't know if we can have it up or, okay, perfect. So my first point that I speak about, I think I'll just go in reverse of what Fadi presented, although there's a lot of similarities and also with what Catherine said. So my starting point would be the crisis that we're in, which is COVID-19, which has impacted all of our lives, but also the livelihoods of many. And when I'm speaking here, as was mentioned before, I don't think we're speaking only about the health impact or the healthcare system being impacted, but also the economic, social, political, and security impacts as well that will be even much more devastating and long-lasting as the crisis unfolds. And I think it's important also to note here that we shouldn't focus our attention on the number of fatalities and incidents either in the Middle East or in Africa, but again on the longer impact. And here I would like to maybe just note that although we have done research and a lot of institutes have done a lot of research on the overlap specifically between COVID-19 and the peace and security domains, specifically on terrorism. But what we have now is more of projections of the trends and patterns across different regions and across different terrorist groups. But actual evidential data can only be drawn as the crisis unfolds and once it's over. We're still in the crisis. There is a lot of implications and ramifications of the crisis, and thus a longer period of time is needed to draw evidential analysis. So just again, to have a look at the overlap between COVID-19 and terrorism, I will just go through a couple of trends on the global scene. So if we can have the next slide, thank you. So what we've seen, and as mentioned before, we saw that COVID-19 has played as a magnifier of pre-existing peace and security threats, but also of vulnerabilities and grievances on the ground. So we have seen an exacerbation of poverty, exclusion, inequality in different regions across the Middle East and Africa. But we've also seen what Catherine alluded to is the feelings of isolation and uncertainty and anxiety and depression, all of which are compounded threats that terrorists groups play very well on, so as to bring more recruits into their ranks, but also to justify a lot of their attacks. It gives them a cause and gives them a lot of meaning. The second trend that I would like to speak about is what we've seen recently, probably since 2016 and onwards, is a lot of counter-terrorism measures were actually being very successful. We've seen that in some countries, a lot of grounds and a lot of battlefield attacks and operations on the ground have actually been successful. And thus what's happening now is that terrorist groups are seeing it as quite an opportune moment to regain the momentum and try to regain the territories that they have lost in the last couple of years. The third trend that we've seen is that, of course, what governments are focusing on now is how to provide healthcare support, but also relief and recovery assistance to a lot of their population. And therefore, their resources and their attention have been diverted elsewhere. And again, what's happening now is that terrorist groups are trying to manipulate this vacuum that's either on the ground, but also over the social media or within even different gatherings between people. There is not that heightened security focus on terrorism at the moment. And the fourth trend is that we need to see how different terrorist groups are responding differently to the pandemic because they're not all responding in the same manner at all. For example, as we saw in Boko Haram in Nigeria, they have continued their attacks and their operations on the ground. ISIL, for example, initially spoke about COVID-19 as a hoax, but then eventually started embedding it in their narratives and trying to build on it for their benefit. But what was surprising is that groups like Al-Shabab, for example, and Taliban in Afghanistan have actually taken a different or a very untraditional approach, is that they themselves have either provided humanitarian assistance to a number of communities, or at least have allowed that humanitarian agencies would gain access to the populations under their control. So again, it's very important that we see how different groups have responded differently to the COVID-19 pandemic. If we could go to the next slide, please. So just zooming in on the African context more specifically, what we've seen is that terrorist groups, as I mentioned before, have seen it as an opportune moment and have tried to expand their territorial footprint. And while this is manifested much more in West Africa rather than in other areas, either in Africa or in the Middle East, but again, as the crisis unfolds, we're anticipating to see maybe similar patterns. Secondly is the, again, exploitation of the pandemic in their propaganda, specifically to fuel intercommunal violence. And we've seen a lot of instances where tensions have raised between different communities, different clans, and different tribes, but also, again, to justify their attacks and operations and to gain more recruits to their ranks. Governments, on the other hand, as I mentioned, have either diverted their attention or resources. They have closed their borders, which resulted in the postponement of some military operations, specifically counterterrorism. Secondly, they have deployed their own militaries and our security forces to enforce lockdown and curfews, again, leaving space for terrorist groups to carry out more operations. And thirdly is the reduction of troops contributing to security measures or operations in other countries. And here we're specifically talking about the African Union mission to Somalia, all of which could very much and have already resulted in heightened number of attacks in Africa. But I think it's also very important that we note here that COVID-19 has impacted both governments and citizens, but also it has impacted terrorist groups. So while this moment is seen as an opportune moment for them, how sustainable is it for them to keep continuing their attacks, seeing the reduction in funding and seeing also the tightening of measures to stop their movement could eventually result in lesser numbers of attacks. So again, this is where we need a longer period of time to assess the situation much more differently. If we can move on to the next slide. So I'll just give a couple of cases to illustrate more what we're talking about here. So I'll start with the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. And again, while we've seen a reduction in their activities in the MENA region, we have seen a shift of their attention and attacks to sub-Saharan Africa, which had eventually resulted in an upsurge of terrorism in a number of countries in Africa. So we're talking here about Burkina Faso, Mozambique, DRC, Mali, Nigeria, Cameroon, and Ethiopia. Specifically, when we speak about the case of Burkina Faso, we've seen an upsurge of death resulting from terrorism from 86 last year to 593, which is a striking 590% increase, again, primarily caused by the Islamic State in Greater Sahara. Another case in the following slide. If we can have the following slide. Yeah, So another case is the case of Al-Shabab. I think there's a slide before this one. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you. So the case of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And again, they're using the situation very much to their benefit. And we've seen this in the heightened amount of radicalized nationals who are being recruited in their ranks, but also because of the exacerbation of the grievances and vulnerabilities and the use of social media and online platforms so as to gain more recruits. And secondly, is how they're embedding the pandemic in their narratives. Again, they're saying a lot of how the pandemic has been a punishment to the West, or how it's now time to fight stronger and reunite because it's the moment for them to flourish. Another maybe trend that we've seen, specifically talking about closing the borders, is how the closing of the borders between Mali and Mauritania had led also to the postponement of security measures or operations, and evidently complicating the situation in Mali, for example, as we have seen an upsurge of attacks there as well. The third case that I wanted to give a spotlight on is the case of Al-Shabab, and it's quite interesting because Al-Shabab have used the pandemic as so that they would present themselves differently as a governance provider. So they're now a governance competitor when it comes to who provides services and products even to the populations. And here they have not only allowed humanitarian agencies to gain access, but they themselves have also established isolation and healthcare facilities and have launched public awareness campaign. And on the other hand, what they have tried to do is to undermine the state capacity. And as such, they have, in their last attacks, have focused quite primarily on attacking either officials or local governments, and are trying to seize territories on the ground because of that. So if we can move to the other slide. So now I'll just present a couple of recommendations from what I've explained, but also specifically because we at CCCPA have conducted a webinar on terrorism in the shadow of the pandemic, where we brought together experts from the PVE, CVE, CT, and DDR sections, so we can see the overlap between the COVID-19 and terrorism. So if we can have the next slide. So first and foremost, we need to see COVID-19 as a governance challenge. As I mentioned, what we're seeing now is an increase in structural vulnerabilities and institutional grievances. And thus we need to understand and look at COVID-19 as not just a pandemic or a disease, but rather we need to have longer term plans that have the element of how to combat the disease, but also how to sustain peace and address the root causes of terrorism. Secondly, is of course the imperative of investing in prevention, but also in resilience building. And again, I think it's quite important, since we're seeing a reduction in counterterrorism funding and operations, is that we shift our focus now to prevention, to prevent the pool of recruits, and to make sure that all the recruitment methods and trials that are specifically directed to the online platforms are stopped and are combated sufficiently. It's also important that we look at social contracts and social cohesion when we speak about resilience. And as I mentioned, we're seeing a lot of intercommunal violence. So it's much more important now that we look at the aspect of social contracts and trying to build trust between not only communities and citizens, but also the relationship with the national government. Thirdly, is to have a people-centered and whole of society approach. And here, I think it's important to note that populations and communities are the first line of defense when it comes to terrorism. And therefore, we really have to take into consideration these populations and their different sectors. We need to take into consideration women, men, youth, tribal leaders, religious leaders, and we really need to listen to them. It's not just a box checking exercise where everyone is in the table or sitting at the table, but rather to actually listen to their needs, either perceived or actual grievances, but also their needs, either perceived or actual. Fourthly is a whole of government approach. And again, as I mentioned, COVID-19 is a multi-layer, multifaceted crisis. And therefore, we need all the different institutions within the government to come together and to try to find a balance between their mandates and interconnections between their mandates to serve their people in a more efficient way, especially when it comes to countering terrorism. Lastly is the importance of regional tools and structures. And I think we need to point out that we already have regional economic communities and mechanisms in place, and they have already policies and capacities that we should build on so that they support these national efforts. So I'll quickly run over our Preventing Radicalization Extremism Leading to Terrorism program, and this speaks specifically on the recommendation of building interventions based on prevention or preventing violent extremism. So if we can move to the next slide. So again, the assumption here for our program was that security-based counterterrorism measures are quite important, but they need to be complemented with a preventative approach. Secondly is the importance of having the local communities equipped and more resilient towards radicalization and extremism. And third is, of course, the component of ideology. And as Nejib mentioned, we see a lot of radicalization happening also offline in some mosques and in some gatherings. And therefore it's usually built on the ideology and religious ideology. And therefore it is very, very important that we tackle this aspect when it comes to our preventative work. And move to the next slide. So our objectives was to build community resilience towards radicalization and extremism, and secondly, to create barriers of entry to terrorist organizations and undermine their ability to recruit more people. So if we can move to the next slide. Again, yeah. So I'm sorry, the slide is messed up a little here, but anyways, so our program is built on 4 core modules. The first is we look at the interlinkage between conflict and terrorism, and here we provide a conflict analysis exercise and a radicalization exercise so that our participants, who are community leaders, especially from Africa and the Middle East, would be able to analyze their situation and their context, and again, their grievances and their needs, and how to become positive agents of change. Secondly is we look at the ideological component. And here we again look at terms such as jihad, hakimiyya, takfir, all that are used in the narratives of terrorist groups, but we give them the right or the mainstream interpretation of what these concepts mean and how they should be interpreted in different contexts. Thirdly, is that we look at the different social media outlets, posts, and narratives of different terrorist groups, and we assist the participants in critically analyzing these narratives and pointing out where they have gone wrong. Fourthly is a module where we give them a set of skills and tools so they are able to craft their own alternative, positive, peaceful narratives. And again, it's important that I raise the point here that in conducting this training, we bring trainers from the context that we're working on, either in Africa or Middle East. So they would help us with the right language, with the understanding of the context, and how to actually craft these positive narratives and then disseminate them among the areas of influence of each of these leaders. So we have two levels of the training, one that is directed for community leaders and one directed for religious leaders. Specifically, again, for what Nejib said, is that they require a different set of training that focuses specifically on the theological aspect, and so that they themselves would preach in a more positive and peaceful way. So here is just pictures that I selected, and I really like the one in white and black because it's actually a woman giving a presentation about the messages and the narratives that we helped her to craft in our training. And as you can see, she's actually lecturing men there. And this was in Nigeria, where it's very difficult for a woman to uphold such a position. And a second one was also a preacher who was, again, giving different messages, but also to different officials in the government and not just the communities, so that the messages have gone wide through the communities, but also on the government level. I think that's it from my side. Sorry if I took more time, and thank you for listening. You're muted.
Thank you very much. Thank you, May. It was a bit long, but very interesting, very interesting. Like the previous presentations, I'm so happy that we got or received this massive, I would say, important insights from three of you, four of you, I would count Eliza as well in this group, although she's our accomplice. I have few ideas here to suggest as a follow-up. I'm not. I would wait for the for your contribution to a follow-up on this. I don't want this to be a one-shot webinar. How to go further into involving our colleagues in New York, especially in the peace keeping operation or the peace center, which is one of the most important program in our headquarters, plus women in peace and sustainable development. So I would like to enlarge this, your contributions to the global level, although we are going global, since we are going to issue a press release on this thing. Also, second point, I'd like you to think on each one of you contributing to the the Global Observatory, which is our platform for exposing ideas to the large public. Needless to say that the Go, which is the website or the soapbox of IPI, where everybody writes. We're not a Piccadilly Circus, but we are a global platform for promoting interesting ideas. And I think your ideas today, three of you, have been quite important, that they trigger the interest in my mind for you to write with more focus. I mean, you are already focused, but each one in his or her approach to Dalia will help you to guide you through the Go, where you could see the large array of prominent writers in the world from the different parts of the world. And I think it would be fair to give you back visibility on the very interesting insights that you provided us with. Without delay, I will give Dalia the. Thank you, Dalia, for sharing with through the chat the idea, the website on the globalobservatory.org. Dalia will make the closing remarks, but before Dalia starts, I'd like to see if any of you, Catherine, Fadi, Maya just spoken, have a few ideas or to share with us as reactions to what has been said. Yes, no, maybe?
Yes. So I see some commonalities in all the talks. So we've been discussing that this is indeed a multi-layered crisis that has both economic, health, security effects. We see how extremist actors are exploiting both perceived and actual grievances. We've seen also in particular the pushing of disinformation and using online platforms in recruitment and the processes of belonging. So I think, to both combat this phenomenon, I think we cannot underestimate the role of online platforms in recruitment processes. And also the final speaker said also the important point about how extremists are experts at hijacking religion. So it's not actually about proper belief, it's about turning religion into ideology. So to obtain that kind of not just digital literacy, but also obtain literacy in religion and how that's being exploited by extremists. So those are some of my thoughts and commonalities in terms of the themes we've been presenting on.
Thank you, Catherine. This is very, very interesting and note-taking. Fadi?
Maybe two notes very, very quickly. It's extremely interesting to notice, and this confirmed a few information I had, the progress in African content, in fact, which is becoming, I think, a new hub with lots of specificities too. So thank you, Mai, for what you presented and the work. I'm looking at the report also that you shared with us, extremely important. I think we need to learn more about, and through your work also, the specificity of what's happening. I mean, on the African content, which also include lots of different sub-hubs or different situations. But I think it's extremely important. And then the second point I would like to raise, and based also on the mention of the link to religion and religious communities and preaching that narrative. This is a whole area, I mean, extremely important. Just one point in relation to the current crisis and pandemic. We have, in fact, two scenarios nowadays. We have a scenario where the tension between the religious communities and the governments is being exacerbated because of the new measures taken by the government related also to religious practice on the one hand, and on the other hand, there is another scenario where there is an increase in collaboration, where religious communities are playing a role as in preventing the pandemic and facing the pandemic with the governments. And I think this is something to learn from and to see how exacerbation can be faced and how collaboration can be increased to serve later on also, in my scenario, reaching the third level, of people who are vulnerable to extremism, of course, also because of the current situation.
Thank you. May?
Yeah, thank you. Again, I'm also really happy to see the similarities and commonalities between our presentations. And I think as Fadi mentioned, it's important that we look at the same actors as both a conflict or an actor that can lead to conflict, but also an actor that can lead to peace. I think we just need to capacitate them with the right tools and right skills. I would also like to bring our attention again to the need for preventative measures now. I think need to focus on how to deliver them either differently or on different platforms through education, through social media and so on. So I think the discussion needs to take forward how to conduct prevention with what we have now, with the reduction of capacities and funding and so on. The third element, and again, I would agree with Fadi and also Catherine, is the communities. And we need to really have communities with us all the way through in our interventions. We need to engage them and we need to listen to them. So I think, yeah, I will be here.
Yes, thank you so much, three of you. Dalia, with the concluding remarks, please.
Thank you, Nejib. Thank you, everyone, for all your expertise and insight into this. I will just, in my statement, just focus a bit on women as an important concept within combating violent extremism. So, as we mentioned through all your presentations, in times of crises, feelings of hopelessness characterized by high unemployment rates, especially now with the pandemic, low quality education systems, mounting intolerance, distrust, and hate speech can be exploited by violent extremist groups, as you mentioned. And these contexts reinforce gender inequalities and they limit women's rights and they affect their livelihood opportunities and security. And women of all ages are increasingly have become a target of extremist violence and terrorist acts, including the use of sexual violence and slavery to undermine their rights and freedom, while also being recruited by violent extremist groups. And a key component, as was stressed by everyone, is preventive strategies to the threat of violent extremism. We must ensure adequate representation of women around the table when policy and programming is being developed, as well as also in the security sector and in operational law enforcement roles. And there must be greater awareness of how different people are targeted for recruitment and how they differently experience victimization by extremist groups. And a focus should be placed on ensuring that existing strategies and policies are aligned with human rights-based frameworks and accountability frameworks that are dedicated to women's rights, gender equality, non-discrimination, and women's empowerment. Bridges and synergies between gender equality and preventing violent extremist agendas should be built and reinforced. And within these frameworks, socioeconomic factors to prevent women and girls being recruited should also be addressed. And as everyone stressed, education is key within this. Lack of inclusive educational opportunities for girls opens avenues for recruitment. Quality education must be invested in, and it would also be an opportunity, I think, to include education in peace agreements and treaties. Frameworks can be created for collaboration between civil society, national and international NGOs that are linked to good practices led by women and women's organizations at the local level. And I was really happy to see that photo, May, in your presentation of the women preaching to the men. That was really, I really like that photo. Communities and stakeholders can establish gender-sensitive early warning systems where the role of women is central and where gender-based violence and violations can be used as a sort of early warning indicator to assess the vulnerability and the lack of resilience of the society. And as was stressed by everyone, central to building community resilience are religious leaders. And I'll conclude with just one example, which is this organization called PayMan. It's a Pakistani project aimed at building awareness in conflict-prone districts to counter radicalization and extremism by emphasizing the role of women. So what they do is that they understood that an indigenous and homegrown approach is required for conflict transformation and combating radicalization. So they built the capacity of female madrasa teachers, women activists of other faiths, and female leaders of religious political groups. And they formed a coalition known as Women of Faith Building Social Cohesion in Pakistan. And they realized that in order to reach those who have been radicalized, they need to start with the family, and more specifically the mother. So they empowered mothers across communities through education and knowledge and working groups. And they worked with the mothers to approach radicalized sons and children and encourage them to rejoin their de-radicalization programs. And at the same time, they linked to community reconciliation, school management committees, teachers, parents to disseminate peace messages and organize student peace groups. So what they did was they also linked to the youth through women. And this is just one example of a grassroots women's organization that demonstrates how women can directly impact their communities through preventive frameworks to address violent extremism.
Thank you, Dalia, our brilliant policy analyst. And I think we have plenty of ideas, plenty of tools and instruments that you have wisely provided, all speakers without any exception. now. I think we will wait for your guidance, I would say, suggestions, how to take this from here, and maybe also look at audiences that we should involve in the future. This time we've been only 6, and I think we should target, maybe discuss the audiences that we should involve next time: religious leaders, academics, diplomats, women, who could be, of course, among all these audiences I just mentioned, but these are not the only audiences that we should look at to, I would say, enlarge the interactivity over these very, very important matters. So I will conclude by thanking you very, very much, Fradi, May, and Catherine, and my colleagues Eliza and Dalia. And I do look forward to hear from you. I shared with you my contacts, my mobile and my email. I will add, before we conclude, my personal email, and counting on you to get back to us on different ideas and initiatives on this region, Middle East and North Africa, which is unfortunately the theater and the target of these theories of and ideologies of other times. I will be more optimistic than what I just said now, and hopeful that we will, with all our efforts, women and men together, government and civil society and grassroots, will overcome this ordeal as the rest of the regional groups. I cannot but think of Europe during the 30s until the end of the World War II, which, as soon as the World War II stopped, Europe started rebuilding itself through regional integration. That has provided Europe with one of the best tools of preventing war in from the map of Europe, and created in Europe the largest gathering, despite Brexit and others that have given a lesson. And my hope is that in our region, we would also think of a homegrown approach to regional integration and cooperation that will put an end to the different divides, conflicts, and differences. On this, I will wish you all the best. Salam, peace, shalom, and we'll see you very soon, I hope. مع السلامة.